Okay, good morning, class. Today is April 2nd, is 30. Today we're going to be going over chapter 15 of To Kill a Mockingbird. The quiz assignments already on Google Classrooms, as well as a vocabulary assignment. I made a slightly different one this time. Instead of having you read sentences and using context clues to determine the unknown word, this time I'm having you look up the words yourselves and completing a vocabulary square. So I found a kind of interactive template. So I put that on for the vocab for chapter 15. So it's a little bit different than what you've been doing. I put instructions on it. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to either reply on Google Classrooms or on email or in YouTube Live. Any of those are fine. And I'll continue adding the summaries to the chapters after I go over this session. So you'll see the summary of the chapter 15 on there in about 30 minutes. Okay, so let's begin. Chapter 15 is where the story actually gets good. So not that the story hasn't been good up to this point, but this is where the story starts to get some excitement. So in chapter 15, it begins by letting us know that Dill is allowed to stay for the entire summer. This reveals a lot about his relationship with his mother, the fact that she's willing to let him stay and make him, even though he ran away from home. You would assume most parents would be pretty upset about that, would be pretty concerned about why their son ran away. But she kind of just accepts it. She even writes him a long letter kind of apologizing and allowing him to stay. So that kind of shows like a weird dynamic that Dill has with his mother, which is probably one of the reasons why he doesn't want to stay there, just lack of acceptance. After that, we find out that there's a group of men who come to talk to Atticus. Now, Scout's aware that people are talking about her family, but she's still fairly young. I'm thinking she's like 9 or 10 at this point. She doesn't seem to quite grasp the gravity of the situation. Jem, on the other hand, does. Jem realizes that his father's in danger. He's worried about his father. He has that new respect for his father ever since the dog shooting incident, but he's still worried for his father. He knows his father's older than most of the other men in town, and he has some concern for him. So a large crowd of men shows up at Atticus's house. They talk to Atticus outside. Scout and Jem both think this is concerning because large groups of men don't typically congregate in Maycomb just at a random time and place unless they're talking about politics or someone died. So Scout assumes someone must have died. Jem, however, is kind of aware that this is like a dangerous situation, perhaps, so he's keeping a close eye on this. We're unsure what his intention is if violence actually were to break out, but it never gets to that. Instead, we find out the people who are there are the doctor, who you haven't met yet, Mr. Avery, who we've met a couple of times. He's kind of a grumpy curmudgeon neighbor who the kids saw urinating in the pond that one day, if you remember way back to when they tried to sneak into booze and Jem lost his pants. That chapter, that was the first chapter we met Mr. Avery. And then Mr. Avery shows up again when Miss Maud's house is burning down. And he's actually the last person to leave the burning house trying to get some of her belongings out. So we know he's kind of like a grumpy old man, but he's also kind of courageous and brave, and he helps a fellow Maconian out. Other people there are Mr. Linkdees, who we've mentioned a few times, but we haven't actually talked to him much. Mr. Linkdees is Tom Robinson's former boss. Tom, of course, being Atticus's client, the one who's been accused of rape. And then the last notable figure who's there is Mr. Hecate, and he's the sheriff. And we met him very briefly during the Rabid Dog chapter, and he's shown up now and again, but he hasn't had a lot of dialogue yet. Anyways, these men are there to talk about Tom and keeping him safe until trial. Now, we're only getting bits of their conversation, but Jem misunderstands the meeting. He assumes they're there to get Atticus, when in fact they're there talking to him about the dangers of getting Tom to trial safely. They know they have to move him back from the county jail to make him smaller jail cell tonight, presumably, and he'll have to be there through Sunday, and then Monday the trial is going to begin. So they're concerned that some people might come and try to harm uh, Tom. So like primarily they're concerned with lynching, like a mob of people might come in there, drag him out, and then kill him themselves before the trial starts. Specifically, they voiced that it could be the people living in Old Sarum. Those are the poor farmers who kind of live out on the outskirts of the community. This includes the Cunninghams, who we've met before. That's Walter Cunningham, who was the first client that we saw Atticus interacting with the entitlements, and also the young boy that Scout beat up at school, Walter Cunningham Jr. He was also a Cunningham. So we've met them very briefly. We know that Atticus likes them. He considers them to be fine people. So he doesn't seem too concerned that they would actually come and harm Tom. But the sheriff mentions that they might drink, and then who knows what men will do if they're on alcohol. After this meeting, Jem voices his concerns with Atticus. He asks if this group of people was a gang, were they there to get Jem? Atticus kind of brushes that off and tells his son that, there aren't any gangs in Macomb. This is a safe town. The KKK was briefly in Macomb. They had a failed attempt at terrorizing a Mr. Levy, who we've not met before and we never meet again. But apparently he ran a small store. He actually sold them the blankets that they were using for their KKK costumes. When they came to terrorize him, he kind of just made fun of them. They felt bad and disbanded, and then there was no more KKK in Macomb ever since. So Atticus tries to convince Jem that his fears are unfounded and that they're in a safe town. Now, as to whether or not Atticus is correct on this, we're going to see later in the chapter. But Jem's fear for his father doesn't subside here, and he continues to be very concerned throughout the chapter. On Sunday, which is the day that the men were talking outside about being the day that something could possibly happen, the kids notice at church 2 men who typically don't go to church show up, and that's Mr. Underwood, who is the newspaper man. He runs the Macomb Journal, and they also notice Heck Tate, the sheriff. Neither of these men typically go to the church, but while they're at church, they're both talking to Atticus, and they're talking about Tom, obviously. And again, Scout and Jem don't quite understand what they're talking about, but you get some subtle clues that that's indeed what they're talking about, like plans to keep Tom safe. Aunt Alexandria attempts to convince Atticus to drop the case, even yet again in this chapter. She lets up somewhat on how to raise Scout and Jem properly. It seems like she's kind of subsided and given up on that front. She's also kind of given up on trying to get Calpurnia fired, but she continues to harass Atticus about how he needs to drop this case, let somebody else handle it. This has an unintended side effect. Jem and Scout both hear this, and this heightens their fear for their father. More so Jem than Scout, but it helps build into that whole idea that Jem feels that Atticus could be in danger, someone could hurt him. So every time Aunt Alexandria brings this up, even though it's not her intention, she's actually causing Jem a lot of distress, and he's becoming kind of fearful. So that Sunday after church, the people in the house kind of behave oddly. Atticus spends the rest of the day by himself. He goes into his study and he kind of just reads books. Aunt Alexandria decides to take a long nap for 2 hours and dares the children to interrupt her, basically like forcing them to be quiet. Jem doesn't want anything to do with Scout or Dill at this point, so he goes into his room and he's reading magazines. And it kind of just leaves Dill and Scout alone. So they go outside. They try to play a game, but they get bored pretty quickly. And then Scout just kind of fills Dill in on all the happenings from the last school year. And she mentions that she really impresses him with all the excitement that he's missed. And that would be exciting to Dill because, again, Dill seems like he gets passed around a lot. And this is kind of like what he considers his home or a safe place. So he probably really would be quite interested. Anyways, that night, when Atticus comes to the children and tells them that he's going to be leaving, he gives them several clues that something unusual might be about to happen. 1, he's carrying a long extension cord with a light bulb attached to it. 2, he decides to take his car, and he never takes his car when traveling in town. Apparently, he travels like 2 miles every day by walking to his office and back 4 times, and that gives him like 2 miles of walking every day, which is his only exercise, he jokes. Um, and then he also tells his children that he won't be back until very late. So he's taking the car. He tells his kids he won't be back until very late, so they're going to be asleep when he gets back. And he's taking an extension cord with a light bulb attached to it. And he leaves. Jem and Scout both get ready to go to bed. They go upstairs. Scout's reading a book. She mentions that she's familiar with Jem's going to bed noises, like the sounds that he makes when he's going to get ready to go to bed. So she knows that's different. So she goes in on his room to check on him, and she finds him getting dressed. So when she asks what he's doing, he lets her know that he's going to go check on Atticus. He clearly wants to go by himself, but Scout threatens to make a scene if he doesn't let her go. So he kind of concedes and lets her follow. Now, on their way out, they don't seem to have any trouble with Aunt Alexandria. They don't even mention whether or not they sneak by her, but we kind of assume she's asleep. On the way out, they also bother to stop and get Dill, and they use like a weird code to get Dill to come out. And then he's smart enough to sneak out quietly and not ask any questions until they're way out of earshot of Miss Stephanie Crawford's house. So then they travel down the streets. They're not sure where Atticus is or where he's gone. There's some thought that he might be going to go talk to Mr. Underwood for some reason, but they're really not sure. So they're kind of just wandering around town in the dark, trying to remain unseen. Eventually, they notice there's a light by the courthouse, so they go there and they see that Atticus has that extension cord and light he brought hanging up, and he's just sitting under that on a folded chair, or folding chair rather, and reading a newspaper. It kind of just seems really out of the ordinary. Their father, this older gentleman, just reading a newspaper with firebugs kind of like going over his head. So they look at him for a few minutes. They see that he seems okay. They decide that they can turn back around and go home. But on their way home, these 4 cars arrive. They're all dusty, which makes them stand apart. Also, they all drive, in order, and the street's been kind of barren up to this point. When the 4 cars arrive, men come out. All of them seem to have weapons of different sorts. Atticus stands up to meet them. He moves rather slowly, folds his newspaper, doesn't seem to be frightened. The kids decide to turn back around and see what's going on. They notice that they're the men from Old Sarum, so this would be exactly the group that the sheriff and Mr. Underwood and the other characters at the beginning of the chapter were worried about. So Atticus has a conversation with them. He asks them to keep it down, which is kind of a comical scene if you think about it. These men are there to kill Tom, right? They're there to like take him out of the prison. We're not sure if they intend to shoot him, hang him, beat him up, whatever, but they're definitely intending to do violence to this man. But when Atticus asks them to, hey, can you guys keep it down? He's asleep upstairs. They all agree to keep their voices down, which is just kind of like a comical scene that even though they're there to kill this guy, they're willing to keep their voices down because he's sleeping. So they have a bizarre conversation. Atticus mentions that the sheriff could be back any minute. The leader of the men kind of laughs at that and says they've sent the sheriff on a snipe hunt and he won't be back until morning at best. So they've a snipe hunt is kind of an old term you guys probably haven't heard before, and that's kind of like a wild goose chase. Just you send someone on an errand that they can't possibly complete, right? So they apparently have made some sort of like a law enforcement call suggesting that something's going on in the woods. There's nothing there. So the sheriff is going to go out into the woods and he'll just be wandering around aimlessly because there's nothing there for him to find, right? Like there really is no problem. So it's called a snipe hunt. Any of you who had been in Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts, you guys might have heard that term because they bring that up from time to time. The men clearly expect Atticus to surrender Tom. It doesn't appear as though they want to hurt Atticus. It appears as though they just want Atticus to get out of the way and to give up. So they have like, superior numbers, they have weapons, and they're kind of just hoping, it appears at least, that they just want Atticus to give up because he's hopelessly outnumbered and he doesn't have a weapon. And he's, just an old man. So the people in town like Atticus, and these are people from town, albeit from the outskirts, but we would assume they don't actually want to hurt Atticus. At this point, the kids run out. So Scout runs out first. She does not seem to realize the danger whatsoever, and she seems to be expecting Atticus to be excited to see her. Instead, though, Atticus kind of panics when he sees Scout. Scout, although notices the smell of alcohol on the men, and then she sees like this just look of kind of like fear on Atticus's face, which is something he doesn't normally show. He's normally very self-confident, even when there's something dangerous going on. When Jem mentioned that, a gang might try to hurt him, he didn't appear worried. When these men showed up, he didn't appear worried. But now that his daughter and son and Dill are there, now he appears concerned. Scout notices that his hands are trembling. He seems to stall for time. And then he tries to tell Jem to take Scout and Dill home. So he orders Jem to take the other kids and go home. He does it in like a very stern manner, and he repeats himself. But Jem just refuses, because again, Jem understands what's going on. Scout knows there's something dangerous here, but doesn't quite get what's happening. Jem seems like he has a pretty good read on the situation, and he just refuses to leave his father. Now, he probably doesn't have the capabilities to do anything here. Jem's only 12. He's a young kid. These are grown men. Some of them have weapons. He's not really going to be able to help his father in a physical confrontation, but he's still showing that devotion that he's just refusing to leave. One of the members of the mob try to grab Jem and force him to leave. Scout then attacks that man, kicking him. She's aiming for his shin, and she's confused when he just falls over, but she actually, kicks him in the groin, which is why the adult male falls over so quickly. When this happens, the men kind of freeze for a second. They order Atticus to get rid of the children, and they give him like a time limit, some arbitrary number, like 5 minutes, I think. Atticus again tries to convince the children to leave, just orders Jem directly, "You've got to get out of here." And normally when Atticus gives the kids an order, they always conform to it, at least to his face. They've continued to harass Boo Radley for a while, but they never did that directly against Atticus. That was always kind of like on the side when he didn't know what was happening, or when they thought he didn't know what was happening. At this point, Scout kind of comes to the rescue. So she notices Mr. Cunningham in the crowd. She's not sure who all the other people are, because again, these are people who kind of live on the outskirts of town in Old Sarum. But she sees Mr. Cunningham, so she starts to talk to him. She mentions she knows Walter, that's his son. She apologizes for beating him up that one time. She mentions that he's been to her house. She sees that this isn't working, and she's kind of confused why he's not responding when she's talking about his son. So she starts talking about entitlements, because she knows that's what her father and he had spoken about. She doesn't know anything about entitlements, so she kind of just brings them up, just really trying to get Walter to interact with her in some way. This also doesn't seem to be going anywhere, so she gets nervous. She mentions that she can feel sweat starting to form on her forehead, and she's starting to panic. Something here causes Walter Cunningham to change, right? So we're not sure what exactly happens. We're assuming it's shame, right? So he's getting ready to perform violence. They're trying to be quiet about it. They don't. When Atticus tells them to be quiet, because Tom's sleeping, all the people in the mob agree. Like, they're coming at night, they're drunk, so it's not something that you would expect these men to be willing to do in the middle of the day, right? They're also with a mob, so they have the extra courage from being part of a large group. And now he's confronted with this young girl. She doesn't understand what's happening, but she's trying to just talk to him. And he's left in this bizarre situation where if he wants to do the thing that he knows is wrong, he has to do it in front of children, some of whom are the same age as his kid. So it kind of shames him and brings him back to his senses. And just probably the thought of performing violence in front of a kid, even if he can convince the kid to leave, the kids are going to find out what he did here this night. And he might not get in trouble with the law, but the children will know, right? And it kind of just shames him to coming back to his senses. Excuse me. He kind of gets down on one knee, tells Scout that he'll talk to Walter Jr. when he gets home, and he thanks her, and then he tells the other men just to leave. So with that, the entire mob disperses. So this has a couple of important uh, concepts here. One of the themes of the novel is that all people are basically good. So even when someone seems like they're completely an awful human being, something about that person is still worthwhile. We saw this with Miss the Boys. She was just this awful, mean, racist, hateful woman. But once Atticus kind of explains her situation, how she's dying, how she's been an addict of morphine for all these years, and she's trying to kick this habit. So she has all these negative qualities, but she also demonstrates bravery too. So she's a bad person, but there's something good about her, right? So Atticus actually looks up to her and wants Jem to learn a lesson from her. Mr. Avery kind of comes across as this jerk, right? But when Miss Maud's house is burning down, he's the last person to leave. He tries to rescue some of her belongings. Um, so it kind of shows good and bad in all people. Cunningham, we know, is respected by Atticus. He's got this work ethic. He's poor, but he works hard. He won't take charity. He's generally looked upon as a good guy by Atticus. Yet here he is with a mob, having come here after he had a lot of alcohol, with the intention of harming another human being, right? And we assume like a lot of racism is in play here because Tom's a black man accused of raping a white woman, so they're here to like harm him, right? Probably kill. So that's a very negative on Mr. Cunningham. Yet he's able to like snap back to who he is, right? He feels shame and he leaves. So we see like good and bad in all these people. So one of the lessons that Atticus has been trying to teach the kids is there's good in everybody. Everyone's basically good at heart. It's just sometimes harder to find the good in someone. So these men were about to do something very bad, but there's still some good in them, which is the lesson Atticus is trying to teach the kids. We also see that Scout kind of learned another lesson from Atticus, a more subtle one, just the way that she was speaking to Walter Cunningham. She tries to bring up a conversation with him on his level, right? So she doesn't know a lot about him, but she knows he has a son, so she talks to him about his son, and she knows he has an entitlement, and she knows entitlements aren't necessarily a good thing, so she brings that up too. She's kind of mirroring the conversation Atticus had with Walter's son at the table when they were having lunch on chapter 3 or chapter 4, I forget which. But she's kind of like mimicking a lot of Atticus's socialization capabilities. So just the way he talks, how he interacts with people, she kind of mimics that, which is kind of cool that she learns that from him. Following the men leaving, we find out that Tom was awake. Obviously, like he's concerned that people are coming to kill him, so he's awake. So he yells down to Atticus. Atticus lets him know it's safe. He doesn't think the mob will be coming back. We also learn that Mr. Underwood, and again, he was the editor and reporter and owner of the newspaper. That newspaper building is actually directly across the street from the courthouse. And he was up and he had a shotgun. So he was covering Atticus. Atticus was never actually alone. He was still in danger, mind you, because all those men in the mob, most of them had weapons. They were drunk, and there are a large group of them, but Atticus wasn't actually alone. It shows that even though racism is a big part of the story and the negative impacts of racism and how a lot of the good people in the story still have these racist thoughts and values, a lot of the people in the town aren't. And they're willing to stand up, some subtly, some directly, to that racism. So on the walk home, we see that Atticus and Jem kind of move ahead of the rest of the group. Dill's carrying Atticus's chair, kind of like a display of affection. Scout's kind of in the middle watching Dill and Jem and her father. She expects Jem to get yelled at by Atticus because he directly defied his father, which is something the kids never have done. But instead, Atticus kind of just rubs Jem's hair, which is a sign Scout sees as a display of affection, kind of like the only real display of affection that Atticus shows Jem. So it's kind of like this bonding moment between father and son. Scout kind of sees it because the whole story's from her perspective anyway. So she's kind of like the witness here to what's happening. Okay, so major themes of this chapter. All right, so major themes of this chapter are, again, that notion that people are basically good at heart. The men came there to kill Tom, but they kind of prove this because once they're confronted with exactly what they're doing, with witnesses, with the idea that people are going to know what happened here today, they kind of snap to their senses. Well, at least Walter does, and then he orders them all to leave. The fact that all the other men are so quick to leave, there's no argument, kind of shows that maybe they knew what they were doing was wrong anyways, and they really just needed an excuse to stop. Another theme for this chapter could always be brave, even when you don't think you can win. That was the lesson that we learned from Miss the Boys earlier, and that Atticus has brought up multiple times. Atticus probably wasn't sure that he could stop the mob, but he wasn't scared of them. He was still going to try to defend Tom, even in the face of this large group of men. And he did have Underwood guarding him with a shotgun, but again, like one guy with a gun versus this whole mob and an old man probably wasn't, a good setup, but he was still going to be brave. In fact, the only time Atticus gets fearful is when his children appear to be in danger. Jem also demonstrates this bravery because he defies his father, he defies the mob of men, he just refuses to leave. And this is after one of the men already tried to grab him and force him to leave. Granted, Scout kicks the guy in the groin and kind of saves her brother there, but he still demonstrates that bravery. Another major component of this chapter is racism, right? It's kind of a major component through the entire story. We learn that there are other people who are also not racist. Link Dees, the boss of Tom Robinson, the former boss, Hecate, the sheriff, and Mr. Underwood, the editor. Again, like we keep hearing Link Dees' name brought up. He hasn't had a huge part yet, but that will come as we go, and he'll actually kind of show himself to be a decent human being. Hecate, we're going to learn more about specifically during the trial and after the trial. Mr. Underwood this is the most we really get from him. He kind of shows up now and again, but this is kind of his big moment in the story. So, hey, Nick, I saw you just popped on. We were just talking about To Kill a Mockingbird. So it's not a book you're reading this year. You read it next year, probably. You're free to stick around for another 2 minutes before I head off. The last two things I just want to bring up for anyone watching this later. On the Google Classrooms, there's a quiz for this. I'll put the summary that I just went over on Google Classrooms. You can see that also. There's a vocabulary squares activity, and then there's just a normal quiz for this chapter as well. So complete those at your convenience. And that's about that. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them. Yeah, I kind of figured, Nick. I think you guys have science next. I'll be on again at 11:30 to do 7th grade, so we'll finish up in Frank at that point. Did you see the messages, Nick, that I sent about Acts 1 through 5? I had saw you posted a question about that. Okay, so I'll just tell you now. Acts 1, 2, and 3 scenes 1, 2, and 3 of the first act were actually done in class, so there isn't a video or a summary for those. The PDFs and the audiobooks are still on the website, but there's no summary of those because that was just stuff that was done in class before we started the whole quarantine Google Live setup. There is a video for Act 1, Scene 4, and Act 1, Scene 5. They're just the first two. So you can do those, listen to those at your convenience. I responded to the thread that you did explaining all that. So if since it's been a while, and since if you don't complete the act 1 scenes 1 through 5, since there aren't summaries for all those, I'll just double the one that you complete after that instead. So I'll just kind of substitute. So that's okay. So don't worry about that. I don't know if you were like sick a couple of days and missed that or whatever. But all right, Sirianni is about to pop on, so I better hop off so I don't mess up his video feed. See you later.